A very good morning, students. We are done with Unit 1, and today I start with Unit 2, that is Approaches to Translation. On a wider aspect, there are mainly three approaches that we are supposed to study. That is the linguistic approach to translation, right? Then you have interdisciplinary approach, and the third one is your cultural approach. So you have to understand how these three approaches are used in order to translate an SL text into TL. Okay, various theorists have been included here, various approaches, theories have been given here, and on the basis of that we will study that how these are the three main approaches that are applied to translation, right? So approaches to translation. Though the art of translation goes back to earliest times in history, it has been approached in various ways. So this is just a background that he is forming. It is not very, very important, okay? But yes, for our knowledge, we must know this. Negative approach. For a very long time, translation had been looked upon as a secondary or inferior activity. The reasons for this negative approach are many. It is subsidiary art or derivative. It distorts meaning. So these were the reasons because of which people said that translation is not a good thing to be done. As the language is culture based, no two languages can be similar. Translation from one language to another will remain a deceptive act. Deceptive is to धोखा देना किसी को, that is what is deceptive. You try to show something else, but the reality is something else. That is what is deception. It misguides the reader, it distorts reality. Over the years, this perception has changed considerably and translation has come to be approached positively. So this was the earlier attitude, but now it has been changed. Those who approach the art of translation positively realize its importance. Translation is literally as old as human civilization. Its story goes back to 2100 BC or even before. The Babylon in 2100 BC was a city where many languages were used. I think ये हमने जब definitions करी है ना तब भी हमने ये चीज़ पढ़ी है. And the role of translator was quite important. Why? Because in this city, many languages were spoken. His services were sought. Translator services. They were sought in conducting official business and in translating edicts. The history of translation studies starts with Romans. The Romans. The opinions of both Cicero and Horace. Now, Cicero, they both are Roman writers, right? And Cicero has also been part of, he's been a lawyer and he's also been part of the political scenario of Romans, right? So, of Rome. So, the opinions of both Horace and Cicero on translation influenced the translators. Both these writers make a distinction between word for word translation and sense for sense translation. तो आपको ये याद रखना है, ठीक है? अगर history आता है या positive approach लिखना आता है, that what from where it began in the Romans. Of course, it began in Babylon, where so many languages were spoken, and then in Roman, where these two used it, and they worked on what? They worked on word for word translation and sense for sense translation. The translation of the Bible also promoted the art of translation greatly. The Bible, translated into a large number of European languages, ushered in the Renaissance movement in the real sense of the term. Now, Renaissance in itself is it is new learning, right? Beginning of new learning. This I also told you earlier, right, when we were discussing the definitions. So the role of translator came into limelight in the mid 17th century. Remember this. Denham, he was an Anglo-Irish poet, cause to perceive the translator and the original writer as equal, though their domains are different. So what this writer said, that the translator and the original writer, they are the same, but what is the issue? Not the issue, but what we have to remember, that their domains, their work area of work was different. Translation continued to be viewed differently by different people. It was only in the 20th century that translation was given the name and status of an important subject, which was called translation studies. In the era of globalization and internet, translation is approached in a new light and context. Now, how it is studied? अब हम 20th century से आगे चले. अभी तक we were studying the background in the 2100 BC, or let us talk about the 17th century, right? But now, when translation got its name and status, what were the contexts in which translation was studied? It is now perceived to be a social cultural bridge. We can understand this, how it is a social cultural bridge, a useful tool to bring together diverse minds, a promoter of business and trade, a means to enrich both source language and the target language. There are many translation methodologies which try to make translation studies a serious subject. Though much has been done and achieved towards this goal, there are many questions which remain to be answered, such as a clear definition of the object of study, a specific methodology, a clarification on terminology to be used, evolving a better interdisciplinary approach. So these are the areas, he says, which needs to be clarified. Certain clarifications needs to be sought. Now, the growth of translation studies is an interesting issue. During the first half of the 20th century, the focus of translation was on fidelity. And what is fidelity? It is quality of being faithful, quality of being accurate. With linguistic and other scientific theories took hold of many fields, the study of translation hinged on to concept of equivalence. What is equivalence? Something which is very close to original. So पहले हम क्या बात कर रहे थे? Quality of accuracy, that is the fidelity. And as far as equivalence is concerned, when linguistics came into being, that was close to original. Now, when we talk of linguists or linguistics, what is linguistics basically? First, you have to really understand this. Linguistics is, of course, study of structure of language. And when we say structure, that includes your grammar. I have been telling you this time and again. That includes your syntax. Syntax क्या होता है? Arranging the words to make a meaningful sentence. And last is the phonetics. Phonetics, how the words are produced. Okay, so these are the areas, or these are the important aspects as far as linguistics is concerned, right? And what he's saying here, that with the linguistic, and who is the linguistic? Who makes study of the scientific study of language, okay? That person is the linguist. Linguistic and other scientific theories, they took hold of many fields, and the study of translation hinged on to the concept of equivalence. Concept of equivalence means coming very close to the original. तो दो चीज़ों में फ़र्क होता है. Please do keep in mind. Try to understand the difference between accurate, जिसकी fidelity की बात कर रहे हैं हम, and second thing he is saying what? He is saying equivalence, which is being close to the original. दोनों में बहुत ज़्यादा difference है. Okay? However, some serious problems cropped in. A crisis came to upset the best of minds connected with translation studies as a serious subject. It was followed by a kind of revolution that set up now paradigms. What are paradigms? Paradigms are patterns that are used by writers, right? So what happened here? The concept of equivalence, that is words equal in meaning or sense from the target language in place of words in the source language, soon gave way to new concepts of function, culture, cognition. Now, it is not possible to translate, to opt for word translation. This thing I have been telling you time and again. Why we can't do? Because every language has a different script, their grammar, their vocabulary, everything is totally different. So word for word translation is not possible. What do? We try to make an effort to keep the context of the SL similar in the TL. That is what is being done. Translation ka basic concept ye hai which you have to remember. Okay, we'll be studying many theories, but what you have to remember is, for every translator who may be using any kind of approach, but in his mind he has that I am not supposed to change the context, I am not supposed to change the bhav with which the SL has been written, the source language text has been written. The concept of function refers to the idea that it is grammatical or linguistic function of words which should be the prime concern of the translator. So when we are talking of what? Function, the new concept, it means the grammatical or linguistic function of words. Oh, here it is, right? Grammatical or linguistic function of words. And the translator must decode the words in the source language and recode them to reset them in the target language, that is your TL. The linguists agree to the view that every language is culture based. It is the task of translator to keep in mind the cultural context of the text to be translated and also the cultural context of the target language. This we touched upon earlier also, that in order to translate, obviously context to hai, but the culture of both the writers who have written the SL text and the TL text, we have to keep the culture in mind. The translator should also, it is written kind but it should be keep, okay? Keep in mind the cognitive process by which knowledge and understanding is developed in the mind. At the moment, translation studies has matured considerably. Broadly speaking, there are three tendencies. So first he is telling you the tendencies and then he will move on to the approaches that are used by the translators. So first is internationalization. Translation studies has overcome the difficulties of national barriers, enabling the researchers and linguists of different countries to interact more confidently and more effectively. This global interaction has brought about a positive shift in the mindset of the critics of translation studies. It has also enabled translators and researchers in the field to discuss the problems that beset them and find out ways and means to effectively overcome them. So what is basically happening? What they are doing? They are kind of globally interacting. That is why internationalization. So translation is taking place at a global level. Next, he says second tendency is theory and practice. Theory of the translation. The relationship between theory and practice in the domain of translation studies has undergone substantial changes. In the second half of the 20th century, theory was mainly normative. What is normative? Relating to norms or standards. Basically, जो rules set किए जाते हैं. That is normative, right? Giving instructions on how to practice translation. The examples of normative theory can be found in theories of Theodore Savary and Peter Newmark. So we will not go into much details, but yes, this is important for you to know that what were the tendencies as far as the approaches to translation were concerned. The machine translation helped in putting the results of translation theory to proof. An empirical approach. What is an empirical approach? Empirical means something which is based on evidence. Evidence-based approach of translation began to be used when the psycholinguistic approach became popular with Hans-Peter Kings and Wolfgang in Germany, Sonja Tikkanen-Condit in Finland, and Candace Singutnot in Canada. So these are the names of the theorists and the practitioners who used translation theory. And last tendency is interdisciplinary work. That is the most obvious thing, which can take place as far as translation is concerned. So, it is in the 20th century itself that translation has to be viewed as an interdisciplinary work. Now, what he means interdisciplinary over here, he means to say that आप सिर्फ internationalization global level पे you can't study translation, you can't do translation. At the level of theory, you just can't, it won't be possible for writers to translate any text just by reading the theory. So what is important is the third tendency where different kind of approaches can be used in translation. So, let us read it from here. Translation embraces as diverse fields as linguistics, cultural studies, psychology, sociology, etc. So far, we are talking about approach to translation in general terms, right? ये tendencies हमने general terms में पढ़ी हैं. Now we come to specific approaches, and there are 3 approaches to translation. So to say, linguistic approaches, it should be, not approaches, interdisciplinary approach, and the cultural approach. So here is your first approach, that is linguistic approach. And what is linguistic? I have already told you, it is a scientific way of studying the structure of language, okay? Scientific study of language basically. And when we study the linguistic approach or when we study linguistics, देखो ये जो theories है ना, ये तो हम पढ़ रहे हैं translation के context में, लेकिन otherwise जब हम approaches theories पढ़ते हैं, theories, which is the 4th genre. I told you novel, poetry, drama, जो last वाला category है theory, जो कि आप 4th semester में पढ़ते हो. Now it has been shifted to 2nd semester, I think. So when you do your post graduation MA में, है ना, तो there you have to study these approaches, right? और अगर linguistic approach की बात हम generally करें, तो हम उसमें क्या करते हैं? We study the form of language, we study the meaning, and we study the context. Remember this thing. फिर आपको ये approach अच्छे से समझ आएगी translation में कैसे use करते हैं. I have also written that it acts as a bridge between 2 languages, the approach. We are using the word approaches for 3 or more than one linguistic approach to the study of translation. Okay, so he's giving the reason why he has used ES. These approaches developed over a long period of time. Some of these have just lost their relevance, their importance, and some others are still in the process of slow growth. They are developing. Translation studies were perceived as a linguistic discipline simply because it involved the study of source language as well as target language. The linguistic discipline क्यों use हुआ? Because it involved the study of the source language and the target language. This approach to translation is in fact ages old. After a long debate over the relevance of literal, free, faithful translation, more systematic, linguistically oriented approaches to translation studies came into vogue, came into fashion. It became a trend in the 1950s and the 1960s. In the words of Monin, developments in contemporary linguistics have made it possible for us to come to these conclusions. Now, Monin is a theorist who's worked on linguistics and who's worked on translation. So what is the outcome we are getting? What the conclusion they are giving? Personal experience of an author is unique and is untranslatable. अब आप यही बोल रहे हो तो कैसे translate करोगे, right? Then the base units क्या होते हैं? जो sounds होती हैं languages की, जिसको phonemes and monemes कहते हैं. They are the sounds, जैसे कि bat, bad, bit, sit. Okay? In any two languages cannot always be compared. Communication through translation is possible when the situations of the speaker and the hearer, or the author and the translator, are kept in view. So these are the three conclusions Monin has come out with. These 3 points need some explanatory comments. The first 2 points go against the very conception of translation. Obviously, translation हो ही नहीं सकती है. वो कह रहा है कि जब आप author को नहीं जानते हो, his story is unique, so you cannot translate. There is no denying the fact that the experience of the author in any language or the content he is concerned with is always unique and cannot be shared with anyone in its totality. तो आप translate नहीं कर सकते हो totally किसी और का experience. Basically ये बात हो रही है, ठीक है? The translator cannot fully implant it in the TL. The second point again points out the difficulties of the translator, since the base units of SL and TL are not comparable. It is only the third point which seems to give some hope, little hope. The translator can communicate the message in the TL effectively if he is aware of the context. आगे देखो. Context of the source text and knows how to decode it and recode it in the target language. तो बस इतनी सी बात है linguistic approach की आपको समझने को कि he should be aware of the context. Only then he can do the coding and recoding in the target language. According to Monin, the results of any translation can have relative success. Relative, it can be successful, it may not be, it may be near something. So, translation may always start with the clearest situations, the most concrete messages, the most elementary universals. But as it involves the consideration of a language in its entirety, together with its most subjective messages through an examination of common situations and a multiplication of contacts that need clarifying, there is no doubt that communication through translation can never be completely finished, which also demonstrates that it is never wholly impossible either. So they are giving you, first they are telling you two things कि phonemes same नहीं होते हैं, author के experiences, they are personal, they cannot be translated. But then what is possible? There is only one possibility to understand the context, which can be decoded and recoded in the target language. Context of what? Context of SL. Linguistics like, इसको हम याकोब्सन पढ़ते हैं, य है ये, ज नहीं पढ़ेंगे, है ना, जे नहीं पढ़ेंगे हम. याकोब्सन, कैटफोर्ड, फॉसेट एंड बेल acknowledge in their own ways the dependence of any theory of translation on a general linguistic theory. Fawcett believes that findings of linguistics can be applicable to the practice of translation and asserts that there is the strong possibility of evolving a linguistic theory of translation. ये हुई आपकी linguistic approach. Linguistic approach translation के help से हम क्या evolve कर रहे हैं? We are involving a linguistic theory of translation. Bell looks upon translation as a sort of laboratory to test any linguistic theory. Fawcett thinks that translator must have a thorough grounding in linguistics. Without an adequate knowledge of linguistics, the translator is like somebody who is working with an incomplete toolkit. So Fawcett is of this opinion that for a translator, he must have the language of linguistics. The linguistic approach to translation has two distinct advantages. And what are they? It takes translation away from intuitive approach. Intuitive क्या होती है? जब हम अपने feelings के ऊपर चीज़ें based होती हैं rather than on fixed. Intuition पे चलते हैं. ठीक है? So, translation through linguistic approach में we are not using an intuitive approach. It gives to translation its much needed scientific foundation. जब linguistic study ही हम कह रहे हैं या linguistics ही हम कह रहे हैं, it is scientific study of language. तो on that grounds जो translation भी है वो उसको एक strong scientific foundation मिल जाती है. Okay, that is what he means to say here. Links between linguistics and translation studies have always been recognized but also criticized or neglected. Many translation theorists have not made adequate use of techniques and insights provided by linguists. There are also many linguists who have shown no interest in domain of translation, which is sad indeed. Those translation scholars who ignore linguistics can only make a subjective and arbitrary evaluation of the translated text. At the same time, those linguists who ignore the art of translation miss on the opportunities of testing their theories in the domain of translation. Hatim is against those who criticize the role of linguistics in the theory of translation. अब जो थेरिस्ट है ना लिंग्विस्टिक्स के वो तो बोलेंगे ही कि आप इसको अप्रोच को यूज करो एंड दे विल गिव ईच एंड एवरी लॉजिक दैट दिस थ्योरी बी यूज्ड एज दे इग्नोर द फैक्ट दैट देयर आर ब्रांचेस विद इन द लिंग्विस्टिक्स whose focus is on practice rather than on theory and which are invaluable to any status of translation. So what you have to remember, the approach focus not on the word level but at the lexical level. और lexical level कौन सा है हमारा? grammar हो गया, discourse हो गया और structure हो गया. So उस basis पे हम linguistic approach use करते हैं. So now I will be reading the important parts from this. You can read this on your own. The linguistic approaches to translation studies have been found deficient. पहले तो इन्होंने आपको बोला कि ये linguistic approach होती है. This is why it should be used, and now he is coming on the deficiencies. क्या कमियां हैं? They have not been able to solve many problems typically concerning the translator. Some linguists have overlooked them as of no concern. For example, in the structure analysis, morphology होती है study of the forms of words and syntax order of words. अगर हम mix कर दो सारे words को, है ना, तो उनका मीनिंग नहीं आता है. लेकिन जब हम सिंटेक्स यूज करते हैं, we place the verb, noun and use proper transformation of sentences, formation of sentences. So we use syntax and we make meaningful sentences. फिर से पढ़ते हैं. For example, in structural analysis, morphology and syntax are analyzed while the difficult problem of meaning, the main concern of translator, is excluded. तो वो इन सारी चीज़ों पे काम कर जाते हैं linguistics, लेकिन वो क्या ignore कर देते हैं? They ignore the meaning. It is clear that the priorities of linguistics and translation scholars are different, and this creates a gap between their areas of study. So basically writer ने क्या कोशिश करी है? पहले आपको अप्रोच के बारे में बताया, फिर अप्रोच कैसे यूज हो रही है वो बताया. Now he is telling you what are the limitations of the approach and why it is not a very good option to be used by the translators. Chomsky's insight influenced language analysis greatly, and most of his fellow men gave priority to the deep structures. तो वो सिर्फ structures पे बात करते रह जाते हैं. कौन? Linguistics. They don't focus on what is most important, that is meaning. Somehow, transformational grammar failed to focus on language as communication, which is the chief concern of whom? Translator. The inadequacy of translation has been conveyed to us by Derrida. a great linguist of our times. Within the limits of its possibility or its apparent possibility, translation practices the difference between signifier and signified. ये इन्होंने concepts दिए हैं Derrida ने, signifier and signified. But if this difference is never pure, translation is less so. And a notion of transformation must be substituted for the notion of translation. A regulated transformation of one language by another or one text by another. We shall not have and never have to deal with some transfer of pure signifieds. अब जैसे हम बात कर रहे हैं ना linguistics की, कि linguistics क्या करते हैं, वो पढ़ते हैं structure. तो Derrida भी यही कहता है. Derrida बात करता है signifiers, structure of language, है ना, signifiers और signified की. तो it is something which is not possible. सिर्फ structure के basis पे हम क्या कर सकते हैं? We cannot translate. What we have to do? We have to focus on meaning. This is the most important thing जो कि linguistic approach to translation ignore कर देती है. ठीक है, ये ध्यान रखना है बस आपने. इसको complicate मत करो, इससे ज़्यादा confuse नहीं होना है. Try to understand what the writer is saying, what is he focusing on. So, pure signifies that the signifying instrument or vehicle would leave virgin and intact from one language to another or within one and the same language. Derrida here points out that no two languages have equal or identical structures, and hence transformation from the source language into the target language is bound to be inadequate or deficient. तो ultimately हमारा conclusion क्या है कि जो linguistic approach है that is not very successful. वो translation को क्या कर देती है? The translation which is done using the linguistic approach is inadequate, it is inefficient. Okay? There is, however, no doubt that linguistic approaches to translation studies have been very useful in changing the attitude of the translator who was previously focused on finding equivalences on word level. Linguists have forced him to focus on lexis, that is the grammar, discourse and structure of the SL as well as the TL in order to convey meaning satisfactorily. It is up to translator to pick up those linguist theories which help him in his work and avoid those which may hinder him in any way. So जब हम linguistic approach की बात करते हैं, आपको ये ध्यान रखना है that this approach is focusing not on the word level या on the meaning level. They focus more on structures and that is why what happens, जो meaning है वो ignore हो जाता है. So हमारी conclusion क्या है? That linguistic approach is not the most is not the best, let us say, way of approaching translation or the best approach which a translator can use. Okay? आप इसको जब वीडियो सुन लेते हैं ना तो एक बार रीडिंग ज़रूर कीजिए and make your notes. उससे आपको clarity आ जाती है. Okay? So today I stop on linguistic approach. Tomorrow we will discuss the interdisciplinary approach and the cultural approach. Go through this. In case you have any doubts, you may ask. Okay? Thank you so much. Take care.